Well, here I am again with my recording hat, this time with oxygen, so hopefully I won't be so short of breath from just speaking. Anyway, I'm showing myself to give you a confession. This is the second attempt at these videos. So why is it the second attempt? Well, in the first attempt I was comparing different versions of different freely available compilers depending on what restrictions and whatnot, and comparing them and going on to look at comparing between IDEs and so on. It all got out of hand. Basically, it gave the viewer too much information about too many things, I thought. So one of the things I've done is I've decided against being non-prescriptive and letting the viewer decide between all kinds of different things, and I've decided to be very prescriptive in that I'm saying that first thing you do is download and install the GNU Compiler collection. The other part of the confession is that by mistake I downloaded earlier versions of MSys and GCC, the GNU Compiler collection. The GCC at SourceForge is out of date, and you should be installing MSys 2 rather than MSys. We'll move on to talk a bit about compilers, what they are and so forth, and then we'll look at downloading MSys 2 and telling you what's in that, and also downloading and installing the GNU Compiler collection. So what is a compiler anyway? Obviously, if you're a beginner at this kind of stuff, I've been banging on about compilers and whatnot, but I haven't even told you what a compiler does. So it takes your plain text file, which will have Fortran commands in it maybe, if you're a Fortran programmer, and you use the compiler to turn it into machine code that will run on your computer. So a compiler is a computer program. You need a Fortran compiler if you want to compile Fortran programs, an Ada compiler for Ada programs, and so on. Now the thing is, you have compiled languages like C, C++, Fortran, BASIC, Ada I mentioned also. As opposed to those, you have interpreted languages. With a compiler, you feed your code file to the compiler and it generates an executable file that has an .exe extension. You just type the executable name to run the program, or click on it in your file manager or whatever. You only need to run the compiler once. However, of course, if your original code file has an error in it, then you actually have to change your code file, recompile it. In general, once you've generated your executable file and everything's working okay, you don't have to run the compiler again. With an interpreter, you type your code into a file just as before, and you run the interpreter every time you run the program. Every time you run the program, the interpreter will go line by line, obey all the commands in the code file, and that's how you run the program. So compilers, once everything's fine, it's run once. An interpreter, you run it every time you run the program. There's some absolutely wonderfully sophisticated code written in Perl, Python, PHP, and well, there's a whole host of interpreted languages, but we'll stick to compiled languages, notably C, C++, and Fortran. If you're a bookish person, what's the best book for C programming? Well, easily I would say it's the C programming language by Kernighan and Ritchie. I've just put in an HTML address there. And for C++, Kernighan and Ritchie were more or less the architects of C, and Bjarne Stroustrup is the architect of C++. That's his home page, and he recommends on the beginning side one of his own books, Programming Principles and Practice Using C++. Fortran, well, I haven't really got a kind of favourite Fortran book I can give you, but I have found recently this little thing. We've found Ed Jorgensen's book, pretty well a book. You can see it's quite a lot of stuff going on here, and yeah, it's basically a free downloadable book, and it looks pretty good to me. Yes, this looks like a very useful resource. But the thing is, as well as that, you have the actual manuals. Your compiler manual is your friend as well as anything. Other books, if you're lucky enough to have a local library with a decent computer section, definitely use that. Of course, there are online resources. Any particular resource, whether it's a YouTube video or a PDF file, you don't really know just by looking whether it's any good or not. Is it accurate? Is it misleading? Well, I'm afraid it's up to you to decide. Good university departments, anything from MIT to UCL, are really good resources. On top of that, you have message boards. Stack Overflow is one programmer's message board that is really, really popular. But for instance, GFortran has its own message boards. So really, message boards are something for you to look up. So, the real must, I think, is we have to install the GNU C, C++, and Fortran compilers, which are part of the GNU compiler collection. GNU, well, what on earth is that? Well, it's worthwhile looking GNU up on Wikipedia. That gives you a pretty good idea of what's going on with GNU. Anyway, you can read all about it here. And part of the GNU project is, well, actually a fundamental part of it is the GNU compiler collection. You can see here that we have C, C++, Fortran. On top of that we have Ada, Go and D. I don't know what Go and D are. I've read a little bit about Ada. So here we are. That tells you what's in the compiler collection, and definitely look at the documentation. You see here you have your Fortran manual for GNU Fortran, your standard C++ library reference manual. GNAT is the Ada compiler apparently, and so on. Download these in PDF format if you want. Anyway, the documentation is there for you to download.